Well, it's that time again. It's 6 o'clock on a Wednesday evening. Excuse me. So it's time for Tales and Cocktails and part 11 of Jane Austen's Persuasion. Now, last week we left with a bit of a cliffhanger because Mrs. Smith and Anne Elliot were speaking of Mr. Elliot, and Mrs. Smith suddenly just exclaimed against him, ending with, "He is totally beyond the reach of any sentiment of justice or compassion. Oh, he is black at heart, hollow and black." Anne's astonished air and exclamation of wonder made her pause, and in a calmer manner she added, "My expressions startle you. You must allow for an injured, angry woman. But I will try to command myself. I will not abuse him. I will only tell you what I have found him. Facts shall speak. He was the intimate friend of my dear husband, who trusted and loved him, and thought him as good as himself. The intimacy had been formed before our marriage. I found them most intimate friends, and I too became excessively pleased with Mr. Elliot, and entertained the highest opinion of him. At 19, you know, one does not think very seriously, but Mr. Elliot appeared to me quite as good as others, and much more agreeable than most others, and we were almost always together. We were principally in town, living in very good style. He was then the inferior in circumstances. He was then the poor one. He had chambers in the Temple, and it was as much as he could do to support the appearance of a gentleman. He had always a home with us, whenever he chose it. He was always welcome. He was like a brother. My poor Charles, who had the finest, most generous spirit in the world, would have divided his last farthing with him, and I know that his purse was open to him. I know that he often assisted him. This must have been about that very period of Mr. Elliot's life, said Anne, which has always excited my particular curiosity. It must have been about the same time that he became known to my father and sister. I never knew him myself. I only heard of him, but there was something in his conduct then, with regard to my father and sister, and afterwards in the circumstances of his marriage, which I never could quite reconcile with present times. It seemed to announce a different sort of man." "I know it all, cried Mrs. Smith. "He had been introduced to Sir Walter and your sister before I was acquainted with him, but I heard him speak of them forever. I know he was invited and encouraged, and I know he did not choose to go. I can satisfy you, perhaps, on points which you would little expect, and as to his marriage, I knew all about it at the time. I was privy to all the fors and againsts. I was the friend to whom he confided his hopes and plans, and though I did not know his wife previously, her inferior situation in society indeed rendered that impossible, yet I knew her all her life afterwards, or at least within the last 2 years of her life, and can answer any questions you wish to put." "Nay," said Anne, "I have no particular inquiry to make about her. I have always understood they were not a happy couple, but I should like to know why, at that time of his life, he should slight my father's acquaintance as he did. My father was certainly supposed to take very kind and proper notice of him. Why did Mr. Elliot draw back?" "Mr. Elliot," replied Mrs. Smith, "at that period of his life had one object in view, to make his fortune, and by a rather quicker process than the law. He was determined to make it by marriage. He was determined, at least, not to mar it by an imprudent marriage, and I know it was his belief, whether justly or not, of course I cannot decide, that your father and sister, in their civilities and invitations, were designing a match between the heir and the young lady, and it was impossible that such a match should have answered his ideas of wealth and independence. That was his motive for drawing back, I can assure you. He told me the whole story. He had no concealments with me. It was curious that having just left you behind me in Bath, my first and principal acquaintance in marrying should be your cousin, and that through him I should be continually hearing of your father and sister. He described one Miss Elliot, and I thought very affectionately of the other. Perhaps, cried Anne, struck by a sudden idea, you sometimes spoke of me to Mr. Elliot? To be sure I did, very often. I used to boast of my own Anne Elliot and vouch for your being a very different creature from... She checked herself just in time. This accounts for something which Mr. Elliot said last night, cried Anne. This explains it. I found he had been used to hear of me. I could not comprehend how. What wild imaginations one forms where dear self is concerned. How sure to be mistaken. But I beg your pardon, I have interrupted you. Mr. Elliot married then completely for money? The circumstance probably which first opened your eyes to his character. Mrs. Smith hesitated a little here. Oh, those things are too common. When one lives in the world, a man or woman's marrying for money is too common to strike one as it ought. I was very young and associated only with the young, and we were a thoughtless, gay set without any strict rules of conduct. We lived for enjoyment. I think differently now. Time and sickness and sorrow have given me other notions. But at that period, I must own I saw nothing reprehensible in what Mr. Elliot was doing. To do the best for himself passed as a duty. But was not she a very low woman? Yes, which I objected to, but he would not regard. Money. Money was all that he wanted. Her father was a grazier. Her grandfather had been a butcher, but that was all nothing. She was a fine woman, had had a decent education, was brought forward by some cousins, thrown by chance into Mr. Elliot's company, and fell in love with him. And not a difficulty or a scruple was there on his side with respect to her birth. All his caution was spent in being secured of the real amount of her fortune before he committed himself. Depend upon it, whatever esteem Mr. Elliot may have for his own situation in life now, as a young man, he had not the smallest value for it. His chance of the Elliot estate was something, but all the honor of the family he held as cheap as dirt. I have often heard him declare that if baronetcies were saleable, anybody should have his for £50, arm and motto, name and livery included. But I will not pretend to repeat half what I used to hear him say on that subject. It would not be fair. And yet you ought to have proof. For what is all this but assertion? And you shall have proof. Indeed, my dear Mrs. Smith, I want none, cried Anne. You have asserted nothing contradictory to what Mr. Elliot appeared to be some years ago. This is all in confirmation, rather, of what we used to hear and believe. I am more curious to know why he should be so different now. But for my satisfaction, if you will have the goodness to ring for Mary, stay. I am sure you will have the still greater goodness of going yourself into my bedroom and bringing me the small inlaid box which you will find on the upper shelf of the closet. Anne, seeing her friend be earnestly bent on it, did as she was desired. The box was brought and placed before her, and Mrs. Smith, sighing over it as she unlocked it, said, "This is full of papers belonging to him, to my husband, a small portion only of what I had to look over when I lost him. The letter I am looking for was one written by Mr. Elliot to him before our marriage, and happened to be saved. Why, one can hardly imagine. But he was careless and immethodical, like other men, about those things. And when I came to examine his papers, I found it with others still more trivial from different people scattered here and there, while many letters and memorandums of real importance had been destroyed. Here it is. I would not burn it, because even then, being very little satisfied with Mr. Elliot, I was determined to preserve every document of former intimacy. I have now another motive for being glad that I can produce it. This was the letter directed to Charles Smith, Esquire, Tunbridge Wells, and dated from London as far back as July 1803. Dear Smith, I have received yours. Your kindness almost overpowers me. I wish nature had made such hearts as yours more common, but I have lived 23 years in the world, and I've seen none like it. At present, believe me, I have no need of your services, being in cash again. Give me joy, I have got rid of Sir Walter and Miss. They are gone back to Kellynch, and almost made me swear to visit them this summer, but my first visit to Kellynch will be with a surveyor to tell me how to bring it with best advantage to the hammer. The baronet, nevertheless, is not unlikely to marry again. He's quite fool enough. If he does, however, they will leave me in peace, which may be a decent equivalent for the reversion. He is worse than last year. I wish I had any name but Elliot. I am sick of it. The name of Walter I can drop, thank God, and I desire you will never insult me with my second W again, meaning for the rest of my life to be only yours truly, William Elliot. Such a letter could not be read without putting Anne in a glow, and Mrs. Smith, observing the high color in her face, said, "The language, I know, is highly disrespectful, though I have forgot the exact terms. I have a perfect impression of the general meaning, but it shows you the man. Mark his professions to my poor husband. Can anything be stronger?" Anne could not immediately get over the shock and mortification of finding such words applied to her father. She was obliged to recollect that her seeing the letter was a violation of the laws of honor, that no one ought to be judged or to be known by such testimonies, that no private correspondence could bear the eye of others, before she could recover calmness enough to return the letter which she had been meditating over and say, "Thank you. This is full proof, undoubtedly, proof of everything you were saying. But why is he acquainted with us now?" "I can explain this too," cried Mrs. Smith, smiling. "Can you really?" "Yes. I have shown you Mr. Elliot as he was a dozen years ago, and I will show him as he is now. I cannot produce written proof again, but I can give as authentic oral testimony as you can desire of what he is now wanting and what he is now doing. He is no hypocrite now. He truly wants to marry you. His present attentions to your family are very sincere, quite from the heart. I will give you my authority, his friend, Colonel Wallace." "Colonel Wallace? Are you acquainted with him?" "No, it does not come to me in quite so direct a line as that. It takes a bend or two, but nothing of consequence. The stream is as good as at the first. The little rubbish it collects in the turnings is easily moved away." Mr. Elliot talks unreservedly to Colonel Wallace of his views on you, which said Colonel Wallace, I imagine to be in himself, "I am a sensible, caring, discerning sort of character. But Colonel Wallace has a very pretty, silly wife, to whom he tells things which he had better not, and he repeats it all to her. She, in the overflowing spirits of her recovery, repeats it all to her nurse. And her nurse, knowing my acquaintance with you, very naturally brings it all to me. On Monday morning, my good friend Mrs. Rook let me this much into the secrets of Marlborough Buildings. When I talked of a whole history, therefore, you see, I was not romancing so much as you supposed. My dear Mrs. Smith, your authority is deficient. This will not do. Mr. Elliot's having any views on me will not in the least account for the efforts he made toward a reconciliation with my father. That was all prior to my coming to Bath. I found them on the most friendly terms when I arrived. I know you did. I know it all perfectly, but indeed, Mrs. Smith, we was not expect to get real information in such a time. Facts or opinions which are to pass through the hands of so many, to be misconceived by folly in one and ignorance in another, can hardly have much truth left. Only give me a hearing. You will soon be able to judge of the general credit due by listening to some particulars which you can yourself immediately contradict or confirm. Nobody supposes that you were his first inducement. He had seen you indeed before he came to Bath and admired you, but without knowing it to be you. So says my historian, at least. Is this true? Did he see you last summer or autumn somewhere down in the West, to use her own words, without knowing it to be you? He certainly did. So far it is very true. At Lyme. I happened to be at Lyme. Well, continued Mrs. Smith triumphantly, grant my friend the credit due to the establishment of the first point asserted. He saw you then at Lyme, and liked you so well as to be exceedingly pleased to meet with you again in Camden Place, as Miss Anne Elliot, and from that moment, I have no doubt, had a double motive in his visits there. But there was another and an earlier, which I will now explain. If there is anything in my story which you know to be either false or improbable, stop me. My account states that your sister's friend, the lady now staying with you, whom I have heard you mention, came to Bath with Miss Elliot and Sir Walter as long ago as September. In short, when they first came themselves, and has been staying there ever since. That she is a clever, insinuating, handsome woman, poor and plausible, and altogether such in situation and manner as to give a general idea among Sir Walter's acquaintance of her meaning to be Lady Elliot, and is general a surprise that Miss Elliot should be apparently blind to the danger. Here Miss Smith paused for a moment, but Anne had not a word to say, and she continued. This was the light in which it appeared to those who knew the family long before your return to it, and Colonel Wallis had his eye upon your father enough to be sensible of it, though he did not then visit in Camden Place. But his regard for Mr. Elliot gave him an interest in watching all that was going on there. And when Mr. Elliot came to Bath for a day or two, as he happened to do a little before Christmas, Colonel Wallis made him acquainted with the appearance of things and the reports beginning to prevail. Now you ought to understand that time had worked a very material change in Mr. Elliot's opinions as to the value of a baronetcy. Upon all points of blood and connection, he is a completely altered man. Having long had as much money as he could spend, nothing to wish for on the side of avarice or indulgence, he has been gradually learning to pin his happiness upon the consequence he is heir to. I thought it coming on before our acquaintance ceased, but it is now a confirmed feeling. He cannot bear the idea of not being Sir William. You may guess, therefore, that the news he heard from his friend could not be very agreeable, and you may guess what it produced. The resolution of coming back to Bath as soon as possible and of fixing himself here for a time, with the view of renewing his former acquaintance and recovering such a footing in the family as might give him the means of ascertaining the degree of his danger and of circumventing the lady if he found it material. This was agreed upon between the two friends as the only thing to be done, and Colonel Wallis was to assist in every way that he could. He was to be introduced, and Mrs. Wallis was to be introduced, and everybody was to be introduced. Mr. Elliot came back accordingly, and on application was forgiven, as you know, and readmitted into the family. And there it was his constant object, and his only object, till your arrival added another motive, to watch Sir Walter and Mrs. Clay. He omitted no opportunity of being with them, threw himself in their way, called at all hours. But I need not be particular on this subject. You can imagine what an artful man would do, and with this guide, perhaps, may recollect what you have seen him do. Yes, said Anne. You tell me nothing which does not accord with what I have known or could imagine. There is always something offensive in the details of cunning. The maneuvers of selfishness and duplicity must ever be revolting, but I have heard nothing which really surprises me. I know those who would be shocked by such a representation of Mr. Elliot, who would have difficulty in believing it, but I have never been satisfied. I have always wanted some other motive for his conduct than appeared. I should like to know his present opinion as to the probability of the event he has been in dread of, whether he considers the danger to be lessening or not. Lessening, I understand, replied Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Clay, he thinks, aware of him, aware that he sees through her, and not daring to proceed as she might do in his absence. But since he must be absent some time or other, I do not perceive how he can ever be secure while she holds her present influence. Mrs. Wallis has an amusing idea, as nurse tells me, that it is to be put into the marriage articles, when you and Mr. Elliot marry, that your father is not to marry Mrs. Clay. A scheme worthy of Mrs. Wallis's understanding, by all accounts. But my sensible nurse Rook sees the absurdity of it. Why, to be sure, ma'am, said she, it would not prevent his marrying anybody else. And indeed, to own the truth, I do not think nurse in her heart is a very strenuous opposer of Sir Walter's making a second match. She must be allowed to be a favorer of matrimony, you know. And since self will intrude, who can say that she may not have some flying visions of attending the next Lady Elliot, although through Mrs. Wallis's recommendation? I'm very glad to know all this, said Anne, after a little thoughtfulness. It would be more painful to me in some respects to be in company with him, but I shall know better what to do. My line of conduct will be more direct. Mr. Elliot is evidently a disingenuous, artificial, worldly man who has never had any better principle to guide him than selfishness. But Mr. Elliot was not yet done with. Mrs. Smith had been carried away from her first direction, and Anne had forgotten, in the interest of her own family concerns, how much had been originally implied against him. But her attention was now called to the explanation of those first hints, and she listened to a recital which, if it did not perfectly justify the unqualified bitterness of Mrs. Smith, proved him to have been very unfeeling in his conduct towards her, very deficient both in justice and compassion. Excuse me. She learned that the intimacy between them, continuing unimpaired by Mr. Elliot's marriage, they had been, as before, always together, and Mr. Elliot had led his friend into expenses much beyond his fortune. Mrs. Smith did not want to take blame to herself, and was most tender of throwing any on her husband. But Anne could collect that their income had never been equal to their style of living, and that from the first there had been a great deal of general and joint extravagance. From his wife's account of him, she could discern Mr. Smith to have been a man of warm feelings, easy temper, careless habits, and not strong understanding, much more amiable than his friend, and very unlike him, led by him, and probably despised by him. Mr. Elliot, raised by his marriage to great affluence, and disposed to every gratification of pleasure and vanity which could be commanded without involving himself, for with all his self-indulgence he had become a prudent man, and beginning to be rich, just as his friend ought to have found himself to be poor, seemed to have had no concern at all for that friend's probable finances, but, on the contrary, had been prompting and encouraging expenses which could end only in ruin. And the Smiths, accordingly, had been ruined. The husband had died just in time to be spared the full knowledge of it. They had previously known embarrassment enough to try the friendship of their friends, and to prove that Mr. Elliot's had better not be tried. But it was not till his death that the wretched state of his affairs was fully known. With a confidence in Mr. Elliot's regard, more creditable to his feelings than his judgment, Mr. Smith had appointed him the executor of his will. But Mr. Elliot would not act, and the difficulties and distresses which this refusal had heaped on her, in addition to the inevitable sufferings of her situation, had been such as could not be related without anguish of spirit, or listened to without corresponding indignation. Anne was shown some letters of his on the occasion, answers to urgent applications from Mrs. Smith, which all breathed the same stern resolution of not engaging in a fruitless trouble, and under a cold civility, the same hard-hearted indifference to any of the evils it might bring on her. It was a dreadful picture of ingratitude and inhumanity, and Anne felt at some moments that no flagrant open crime could have been worse. She had a great deal to listen to. All the particulars of past and scenes, all the minutes of distress all the minutiae of stress upon distress, which in former conversations had been merely hinted at, were dwelt on now with a natural indulgence. Anne could perfectly comprehend the exquisite relief, and was only the more inclined to wonder at the composure of her friend's usual state of mind. There was one circumstance in the history of her grievances of particular irritation. She had good reason to believe that some property of her husband in the West Indies, which had been for many years under a sort of sequestration for the payment of its own encumbrances, might be recoverable by proper measures, and this property, though not large, would be enough to make her comparatively rich. But there was nobody to stir in it. Mr. Elliot would do nothing, and she could do nothing herself, equally disabled from personal exertion by her state of bodily weakness, and from employing others by her want of money. She had no natural connections to assist her even with their counsel, and she could not afford to purchase the assistance of the law. This was a cruel aggravation of actually straitened means. To feel that she ought to be in better circumstances, that a little trouble in the right place might do it, and to fear that delay might be even weakening her claims, was hard to bear. It was on this point that she had hoped to engage Anne's good offices with Mr. Elliot. She had previously, in the anticipation of their marriage, been very apprehensive of losing her friend by it, but on being assured that he could have made no attempt of that nature, since he did not even know her to be in Bath, it immediately occurred that something might be done in her favor by the influence of the woman he loved, and she had been hastily preparing to interest Anne's feelings as far as the observances due to Mr. Elliot's character would allow, when Anne's refutation of the supposed engagement changed the face of everything. And while it took from her the new-formed hope of succeeding in the object of her first anxiety, left her at least the comfort of telling the whole story her own way. After listening to this full description of Mr. Elliot, Anne could not but express some surprise at Mrs. Smith's having spoken of him so favorably at the beginning of their conversation. She had seemed to recommend and praise him. "My dear," was Mrs. Smith's reply, "there was nothing else to be done. I considered your marrying him as certain, though he might not yet have made the offer, and I could no more speak the truth of him than if he had been your husband. My heart bled for you as I talked of happiness, and yet he is sensible, he is agreeable, and with such a woman as you, it was not absolutely hopeless. He was very unkind to his first wife. They were wretched together. But she was too ignorant and giddy for respect, and he had never loved her. I was willing to hope that you must fare better." Anne could just acknowledge within herself such a possibility of having been induced to marry him as made her shudder at the idea of the misery which must have followed. It was just possible that she might have been persuaded by Lady Russell. And under such a supposition, which would have been most miserable when time had disclosed all too late? It was very desirable that Lady Russell should be no longer deceived, and one of the concluding arrangements of this important conference, which carried them through the greater part of the morning, was that Anne had full liberty to communicate to her friend everything relative to Mrs. Smith in which his conduct was involved. Anne went home to think over all that she had heard. In one point, her feelings were relieved by this knowledge of Mr. Elliot. There was no longer anything of tenderness due to him. He stood, as opposed to Captain Wentworth, in all his own unwelcome obtrusiveness, and the evil of his attentions last night, the irremediable mischief he might have done, was considered with sensations unqualified, unperplexed. Pity for him was all over. But this was the only point of relief. In every other respect, in looking around her or penetrating forward, she saw more to distrust and to apprehend. She was concerned for the disappointment and pain Lady Russell would be feeling, for the mortifications which must be hanging over her father and sister, and at all the distress of foreseeing many evils without knowing how to avert any one of them. She was most thankful for her own knowledge of him. She had never considered herself as entitled to reward for not slighting an old friend like Mrs. Smith, but here was a reward indeed springing from it. Mrs. Smith had been able to tell her, which no one else could have done. Could the knowledge have been extended through her family? But this was a vain idea. She must talk to Lady Russell, tell her, consult with her, and having done her best, wait the event with as much composure as possible. And after all, her greatest want of composure would be in that quarter of the mind which could not be open to Lady Russell, in that flow of anxieties and fears which must be all to herself. She found, on reaching home, that she had, as she intended, escaped seeing Mr. Elliot, that he had called and paid them a long morning visit, but hardly had she congratulated herself and felt safe till tomorrow, when she heard that he was coming again in the evening. "I had not the smallest intention of asking him," said Elizabeth with affected carelessness, "but he gave so many hints. So Mrs. Clay says, at least." "Indeed, I do say it. I never saw anybody in my life spell harder for an invitation. Poor man! I was really in pain for him, for your hard-hearted sister, Miss Anne, seems bent on cruelty." "Oh," cried Elizabeth, "I have been rather too much used to the game to be soon overcome by a gentleman's hints. However, when I found how excessively he was regretting that he should miss my father this morning, I gave way immediately, for I would never really omit an opportunity of bringing him and Sir Walter together. They appear to so much advantage in company with each other, each behaving so pleasantly, Mr. Elliot looking up with so much respect." "Quite delightful," cried Mrs. Clay, not daring, however, to turn her eyes towards Anne. "Exactly like father and son. Dear Miss Elliot, may I not say father and son?" "Oh, I lay no embargo on anybody's words, if you will have such ideas. But upon my word, I am scarcely sensible of his attentions being beyond those of other men." "My dear Miss Elliot," exclaimed Mrs. Clay, lifting up her hands and eyes and sinking all the rest of her astonishment in a convenient silence. "Well, my dear Penelope, you need not be so alarmed about him. I did invite him, you know. I sent him away with smiles. When I found he was really going to his friends at Thornbury Park for the whole day tomorrow, I had compassion on him." Anne admired the good acting of the friend in being able to show such pleasure as she did in the expectation and in the actual arrival of the very person whose presence must really be interfering with her prime object. It was impossible but that Mrs. Clay must hate the sight of Mr. Elliot, and yet she could assume a most obliging, placid look, and appear quite satisfied with the curtailed license of devoting herself only half as much to Sir Walter as she would have done otherwise. To Anne herself, it was most distressing to see Mr. Elliot enter the room, and quite painful to have him approach and speak to her. She had been used before to feel that he could not be always quite sincere, but now she saw some insincerity in everything. His attentive deference to her father contrasted with his former language. It was odious, and when she thought of his cruel conduct toward Mrs. Smith, she could hardly bear the sight of his present smiles and mildness, or the sound of his artificial good sentiments. She meant to avoid any such alteration of manner as might provoke a remonstrance on his side. It was a great object with her to escape all inquiry or éclat, but it was her intention to be as decidedly cool to him as might be compatible with their relationship, and to retrace, as quietly as she could, the few steps of unnecessary intimacy she had been gradually led along. She was accordingly more guarded and more cool than she had been the night before. He wanted to animate her curiosity again as to how and where he could have heard her formally praised, wanted very much to be gratified by more solicitation, but the charm was broken. He found that the heat and animation of a public room were necessary to kindle his modest cousin's vanity. He found at least that it was not to be done now, by any of those attempts which he could hazard among the too commanding claims of the others. He little surmised that it was a subject acting now exactly against his interest, bringing immediately into her thoughts all those parts of his conduct which were least excusable. She had some satisfaction in finding that he was really going out of Bath the next morning, going early, and that he would be gone the greater part of 2 days. He was invited again to Camden Place the very evening of his return, but from Thursday to Saturday evening, his absence was certain. It was bad enough that a Mrs. Clay should be always before her, but that a deeper hypocrite should be added to their party seemed the destruction of everything like peace and comfort. It was so humiliating to reflect on the constant deception practiced on her father and Elizabeth, to consider the various sources of mortifications preparing for them. Mrs. Clay's selfishness was not so complicated nor so revolting as his, and Anne would have compounded for the marriage at once, with all its evils, to be clear of Mr. Elliot's subtleties in endeavoring to prevent it. On Friday morning, she meant to go very early to Lady Russell and accomplish the necessary communication, and which she would have gone directly after breakfast, but that Mrs. Clay was also going out on some obliging purpose of saving her sister trouble, which determined her to wait till she might be safe from such a companion. She saw Mrs. Clay fairly off, therefore, before she began to talk of spending the morning in Rivers Street. "Very well," said Elizabeth. "I have nothing to send but my love. Oh, you may as well take back that tiresome book she would lend me and pretend I have read it through. I really cannot be plaguing myself forever with all the new poems and states of the nation that come out. Lady Russell quite bores me with her new publications. You need not tell her so, but I thought her dress hideous the other night. I used to think she had some taste in dress, but I was ashamed of her at the concert. Something so formal and rangé in her air, and she sits so upright. My best love, of course. And mine," added Sir Walter, "kindest regards. And you may say that I mean to call upon her soon. Make a civil message, but I shall only leave my card. Morning visits are never fair by women at her time of life, who make themselves up so little. If she would only wear rouge, she would not be afraid of being seen. But last time I called, I observed the blinds were let down immediately." While her father spoke, there was a knock at the door. Who could it be? Anne, remembering the preconcerted visits at all hours of Mr. Elliot, would have expected him, but for his known engagement 7 miles off. After the usual period of suspense, the usual sounds of approach were heard, and Mr. and Mrs. Charles Musgrove were ushered into the room. Surprise was the strongest emotion raised by their appearance, but Anne was really glad to see them, and the others were not so sorry but they could put on a decent air of welcome. And as soon as it became clear that these, their nearest relations, were not arrived with any views of accommodation in that house, Sir Walter and Elizabeth were able to rise in cordiality and do the honors of it very well. They were come to Bath for a few days with Mrs. Musgrove and were at the White Hart. So much was pretty soon understood. But till Sir Walter and Elizabeth were walking Mary into the other drawing-room and regaling themselves with her admiration, Anne could not draw upon Charles's brain for a regular history of their coming, or an explanation of some smiling hints of particular business, which had been ostentatiously dropped by Mary, as well as some apparent confusion as to whom their party consisted of. She then found that it consisted of Mrs. Musgrove, Henrietta, and Captain Harville, besides their 2 selves. He gave her a very plain, intelligible account of the whole, a narration in which she saw a great deal of most characteristic proceeding. The scheme had received its first impulse by Captain Harville's wanting to come to Bath on business. He had begun to talk of it a week ago, and by way of doing something, as shooting was over, Charles had proposed coming with him, and Mrs. Harville had seemed to like the idea of it very much, as an advantage to her husband. But Mary could not bear to be left, and had made herself so unhappy about it for a day or two. Everything seemed to be in suspense or at an end. But then it had been taken up by his father and mother. His mother had some old friends in Bath, whom she wanted to see. It was thought a good opportunity for Henrietta to come and buy wedding clothes for herself and her sister. And in short, it ended in being his mother's party, that everything might be comfortable and easy to Captain Harville, and he and Mary were included in it by way of general convenience. They had arrived late the night before. Mrs. Harville, her children, and Captain Benwick remained with Mr. Musgrove and Louisa at Uppercross. Anne's only surprise was that affairs should be in such forwardness enough for Henrietta's wedding clothes to be talked of. She had imagined such difficulties of fortune to exist as might prevent the marriage from being near at hand. But she learned from Charles that very recently, since Mary's last letter to herself, Charles Hayter had been applied to by a friend to hold a living for a youth who could not possibly claim it under many years, and that on the strength of this present income, with almost a certainty of something more permanent long before the term in question, the two families had consented to the young people's wishes, and that their marriage was likely to take place in a few months, quite as soon as Louisa's. And a very good living it was, Charles added, only 25 miles from Uppercross, and in a very fine country, fine part of Dorsetshire, in the center of some of the best preserves in the kingdom, surrounded by 3 great proprietors, each more careful and jealous than the other, and to 2 of the 3 at least, Charles Hayter might get a special recommendation. Not that he will value it as he ought, he observed. Charles is too cool about sporting. That's the worst of him. I am extremely glad indeed, cried Anne, particularly glad that this should happen, and that of 2 sisters who both deserve equally well, and who have always been such good friends. The pleasant prospects of one should not be dimming those of the other, that they should be so equal in their prosperity and comfort. I hope your father and mother are quite happy with regard to both. Oh, yes. My father would be as well pleased if the gentleman were richer, but he has no other fault to find. Money, you know, coming down with money, 2 daughters at once. It cannot be a very agreeable operation, and it straightens him as to many things. However, I do not mean to say they have not a right to it. It is very fit they should have daughters' shares, and I am sure he has always been a very kind, liberal father to me. Mary does not above half like Henrietta's match. She never did, you know. But she does not do him justice, nor think enough about Winthrop. I cannot make her attend to the value of the property. It is a very fair match as times go, and I have liked Charles Hayter all my life, and I shall not leave off now. Such excellent parents as Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove, exclaimed Anne, should be happy in their children's marriages. They do everything to confer happiness, I am sure. What a blessing to young people to be in such hands. Your father and mother seem so totally free from all those ambitious feelings which have led to so much misconduct and misery, both in young and old. I hope you think Louisa perfectly recovered now. He answered rather hesitatingly, Yes, I believe I do. Very much recovered. But she is altered. There's no running or jumping about, no laughing or dancing. It is quite different. If one happens only to shut the door a little hard, she starts and wriggles like a young dab chick in the water. And Benwick sits at her elbow reading verses or whispering to her all day long. Anne could not help laughing. That cannot be much to your taste, I know, said she, but I do believe him to be an excellent young man. To be sure he is. Nobody doubts it, and I hope you do not think I am so illiberal as to want every man to have the same objects and pleasures as myself. I have a great value for Benwick, and when one can but get him to talk, he has plenty to say. His reading has done him no harm, for he has fought as well as read. He is a brave fellow. I got more acquainted with him last Monday than ever I did before. We had a famous set to at rat hunting all the morning in my father's great barns, and he played his part so well that I have liked him the better ever since. Here they were interrupted by the absolute necessity of Charles's following the others to admire mirrors and china. But Anne had heard enough to understand the present state of Uppercross, and rejoice in all its happiness. And though she sighed as she rejoiced, her sigh had none of the ill will of envy in it. She would certainly have risen to their blessings if she could, but she did not want to lessen theirs. The visit passed off altogether in high good humor. Mary was in excellent spirits, enjoying the gaiety and the change, and so well satisfied with the journey in her mother-in-law's carriage with 4 horses, and with her own complete independence of Camden Place, that she was exactly in a temper to admire everything as she ought, and enter most readily into all the superiorities of the house as they were detailed to her. She had no demands on her father or sister, and her consequence was just enough raised by their handsome drawing rooms. And that is part 11, my dears, of Persuasion by Jane Austen. Onward, onward next Wednesday at 6 o'clock for Tales and Cocktails, and part 12 of Persuasion. Good night. Thank you for joining me.